Good morning. It's Politics and Grits with Kevin Peterson, Thursday mornings, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. each Thursday. We're here this frigid Thursday morning in Boston, 70 degrees yesterday, in the 20s this morning on Thursday. We're up and down, but we're glad to be here. That was Anita Wilson, Jesus Will, sort of a confession of our faith, of course, our theme song, but it really expresses where we stand as, or where we should stand as Christians, believing and having faith in Jesus' intervention and presence in our life every day, and having that confidence and faith that that Jesus controls our ultimate reality. Good morning again. I'm so glad to be here another Thursday in the house that Pastor Bruce Wall has built. Boston Praise Radio. We're on 102.9 FM live drive time and 31 other platforms, social media platforms. We're glad to be part of this team of broadcasters who reflect their ideas, their focus, their passion, their advocacy through the lens of faith on this channel. There's nothing else like it in all of New England, spreading out across the globe, across the planet. Ideas and sentiment and passions that come out of the city of Boston's Black community. We're glad to have as our guest. We will continue our focus, our concentration on reparations. It's a vast subject line, and we're committed to have this discussion with various individuals and people who come from different walks of life. Rev Dr. Rodney Peterson is our guest this morning. In a few minutes, we're going to talk to him, looking at reparations from the eyes of faith, from the eyes of, I should say, from a theological lens, so to speak. What does reparation mean in terms of repair and reconciliation? What does reparations mean with regard to what debt is being paid, and how do we get to the point of recognizing the debt and then moving towards absolving the debt, so to speak. So we're looking forward to Reverend Dr. Rodney Peterson, who's a visiting researcher down at Duke University. used to be in Boston for a long time, head of the Boston Theological Institute for many years, and also the leader of Cooperative Metropolitan Ministries for a number of years. He is a well-published scholar and preacher and theologian. We're looking forward to talking to him in a few minutes. I want to segue right into our Black History moment. This is the last Thursday in February. We know Black History Month should be every month, but we apply extra focus in this month that is the issue of Carter Woodson, who founded Black History Week, and then it moved to being Black History Month. We want to recognize a religious figure this month, Jarena Lee. I'm reading from her Wikipedia page, and fairly confident that this information is solid. I also want to read from a little highlighted passage from Henry Louis Gates' book, The Black Church, on Jarena Lee. But in Wikipedia, Jarena Lee is recorded or stated as being born on February 11th, 1783. She died this month, February 3rd, 1864. She was the first woman preacher of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That's the AME Church. Born in a free black family in New Jersey, Lee asked the founder of the AME Church, Richard Allen, which was over in Philadelphia, to be a preacher. And although Allen initially refused, after hearing her preach in 1819, Allen approved her preaching. A leader in the Wesleyan holiness movement, Lee preached the doctrine of entire sanctification as an itinerant preacher through the pulpits of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That's Wikipedia. I also want to highlight Jarena Lee, a passage in this wonderful book, very accessible scholarship that everyone could read and should read, Henry Louis Gates. It's the companion book to the PBS series, The Black Church. This is our story, this is our song. Gates writes in this book on Jarena Lee, he said, the freedom to preach had limits, even in the black churches. Women made up the majority of the AME congregations, and they were crucial to establishing new congregations as churches expanded and created missionary and mutual aid societies within the church. But women had no place in the pulpit, Gates writes. As Jarena Lee found out in the early 1800s when she asked Richard Allen to allow her to preach. Quote, I went to see the preacher in charge of the African Society, who was the Reverend Richard Allen, Lee wrote in her memoir, to tell him that I felt it my duty to preach the gospel. He said that our discipline knew nothing at all about it, and that it did not call for women preachers. Jarena Lee goes on to say, there's a great scene at Johns Hopkins University where she is observing someone preach, and Jarena Lee says she describes listening to a man give a sermon. He does a lousy job, and she springs out of her seat and holds forth. Lee later describes the moment I sprang as by altogether supernatural impulses to my feet when I was aided from above to give an exhortation. During the exhortation, God made manifest his power in a manner sufficient to show the world that I had been called to labor. I now sat down, scarcely knowing what I had done, being frightened. I imagined that for this indecorum, as I feared it might be called, I should be expelled from the church. She was not, and Allen, who heard Lee speak, changed his mind in 1819 and named her the AME Church's first woman preacher. That is Jarena Lee, a groundbreaker in the African American church, and we lift her up as someone who is extraordinary and special in the annals of Black history, and certainly in the annals of the Black church, which is something special within the context of this place we call America. The Black church has a special role, a unique role, not only in terms of providing spiritual comfort and aid and a resource, but it has impacted our policy and how we look at, treat, and engage the idea of democracy in a broader sense. That segue takes us over to our discussion, or I should say, I segue into our discussion around democracy, from democracy to the issue of reparations, with our guest this morning, Rev Dr. Rodney Peterson, who has written extensively around faith and public life. We're going to focus this morning a little bit on an article he's written in a book, The Antioch Agenda, Essays on Restorative Church, in 2007. And I recommend this essay. It's in the 15th chapter of this book, the 15th essay, Mission in the Context of Racism, Restorative Justice, and Reconciliation. As I mentioned earlier, Reverend Peterson is the former executive director of Cooperative Metropolitan Ministries that focus in Boston, based in Newton. And he also was for a very long time the director of the Boston Theological Institute, which coordinated scholarly study and collaboration between the major theological schools and seminaries and divinity schools across Boston, ranging from Boston University to Harvard University and Boston College and other schools across Boston. So we welcome Reverend Dr. Peterson. We're brothers in the spirit and brothers in our common humanity. We share the same last name, except his Peterson is spelled with S-E-N. My Peterson is spelled with a S-O-N.
There you go.
That's the distinction. He is also so much more distinguished and so much more recognized and respected across the academic world for his extraordinary work as a researcher and a scholar around matters theological. Good morning, Reverend Peterson. How are you?
Good morning, Kevin, and good morning, audience. I'm doing well on this beautiful day.
Beautiful day. You're calling from Chapel Hill. You're a visiting researcher, I believe, down at Duke Divinity School. So I'm so glad to have you on this morning. Thank you for being our guest. I want to get right into our discussion around reparations, as we've been meditating, so to speak, on reparations for a number of weeks now here on this broadcast. About a month ago, we witnessed in the Boston City Council the introduction of legislation calling for a race commission, something akin to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is tasked with the with activities related to identifying harm related to black slavery and discrimination in Boston, and then making a set of recommendations as to what may look like repair with regard to reparations. So we've been focusing, Dr. Peterson, on reparations and looking at reparations from a variety of lenses. We've been talking to activists, some economists, some academics. We're glad to have you on this morning to talk about reparations with regard to reparations from a theological lens. I want to start with a really broad question, and then want to dig down into your article a little bit. But I want to start with the broad question of talking about debt, as it might relate to harm, debt to African Americans, those who have been historically captured in the process of slavery and then harmed over decades and decades in Boston as victims of the slave trade and systemic racism and discrimination. When some people talk about that, they talk about what's been stolen, what's been misappropriated, where's the harm, and where's the injury. And as I've been thinking about debt personally, as I've been engaging in some of the literature, we certainly can talk about debt related to the personal injury, those who were caught up in slavery and who have individuals who have been traumatized by slavery. We can certainly talk about debt as it relates to the theft of political capacity, some not having the right to vote or to engage in the public square. Black people I'm talking about with regard to white people. And we certainly can talk about debt with regard to what's been stolen culturally with relation to the in relation to the transatlantic slave trade. We know that there are remaining Africanisms, and we know that there are traces, significant traces in terms of African American culture, but still things were stolen. Now, I have a broad question for you in terms of how do you think about this issue of debt as in relation to things that have been stolen from a theological perspective? How do you think about it from the lens of a theologian, a faith leader, a Christian?
Well, first of all, Kevin, I would say there's the important consideration of what's been hijacked most pointedly, and that's the very lives of the people involved. The opening text on the cover of John Wesley's booklet, Thoughts Upon Slavery, written in 1774, contains the following: "And the Lord said, What hast thou done? The vices of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." There is, in fact, then, the theft of life itself. And that needs to be considered as an underwriting, important influence all along the way. If we want to talk about the hijacking of theft, or if we want to talk about theft itself, we can turn to Jamaica alone. In the Act of Emancipation in 1838, which granted full freedom to approximately 320,000 black slaves, but lacked compensation of any means for life. That bill granted a compensation package of over 20 million pounds in 1938 dollars to former slave owners, leaving the newly freed unattended. Race-based slavery may have ended, but racism continues, and it continues to be a theft upon the people involved.
Excellent. Excellent sort of opening, excellent framing into what we really want to talk about today, and just in terms of the lenses of theological reflection on the issue of race. The quote from John Wesley is wonderful. Let's move to the issue around restorative justice as we relate to the issue of debt, what's been stolen, misappropriated, the injury, the harm sort of incurred there. Can you begin for us to frame the response to that, repairing with regard to restorative justice? The term has been bantered around broadly, restorative justice, and contrasted in some ways with retributive justice. Let's talk about reparative justice, and then let's give a contrast of retributive justice so that we can begin to really frame the vocabulary as we move forward in this conversation. What's restorative justice?
Well, that's a good question. Restorative justice takes into account the three parties to a crime.
Mm-hmm.
The crime of the offender, the life of the victim, and the ongoing life of the community. So restorative justice doesn't just deal with the offender, but it deals with all three parties to a crime.
Mm-hmm.
The community, the offender's action, and the effect this has on the victim. This is different from retaliatory justice or punitive justice or compensatory justice. Restorative justice seeks to repair the damage done. Each of these three parties, offender, victim, community, have been affected negatively by race.
And how specifically would you you use the frame restorative justice with regard to reparations? Is it relative in 2022 to talk about restorative justice when in fact we can trace date wise? This is the frame we use, 1619 as being the definitive or a definitive date in terms of the introduction of slavery in the United States. That's probably not accurate. Slaves were probably, or enslaved Africans were probably in this what became the America before then. But we look back at 1619 and we wonder in 2022, is it appropriate to speak about restorative justice in 2022 when the so-called crime, the so-called injury and misappropriation of agency and wealth and culture, the injury done then was happened historically and not contemporaneously in 2022. Is it fair to talk about restorative justice with regard to reparations in 2022?
Well, I think it is fair, but this leads us to the importance of asking a series of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I deal with those questions in the article to which you've referred. Have an obligation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that mean? An obligation. We have
Did we lose you? Okay, I think he's making some adjustment. We're talking with Reverend Dr. Rodney Peterson, visiting researcher and scholar at Duke University. He has been a fixture in Boston for a number of years, engaging around the issue of race, and we're really focusing on an article that he wrote in 2007 around racism, restorative justice, and reconciliation. And we're specifically talking about what's the relevance of restorative justice as opposed to compensatory justice or retributive justice. What's the relevance in 2022 in terms of the so-called victimization of African Americans in the during the slavery trade? Dr. Peterson, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, I'm sorry we missed you a little bit. You were why don't you start at the beginning? I think we just got cut off on the sound through the station or the phone.
To get into the question of restorative justice,
yes,
it's useful to follow a series of questions.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, do I have an obligation? Secondly, what is the question of what is owed?
Mm-hmm.
Or thirdly, if restorative justice principles can enable a discussion of what might constitute reparative acts, certainly this discussion needs to be set in the wider context of obligations and entitlements
Mm-hmm.
faced by the living. And fourth, how far back do we reach in seeking to right wrongs? Restorative justice, which deals with the community, the victim, and the offender, leads us to these four questions. First of all, do I have an obligation? Secondly, what is the nature of that obligation? Thirdly, how does this obligation fit into the wider context of community? And four, how far do we need to go to root out the problem?
Well, let's start at the top. We may go through all those questions, but let's start at the top, the basics. Do we have an obligation to engage around reparative justice, restorative justice with relation to slavery and systemic racism expressed towards the African community? Do we have an obligation? What's your theological response to that?
Well, my theological response is to go into the following.
Mm-hmm.
Those who were shoved through the gates of the Cape Coast castles are no longer among us.
Yeah.
The Irish famine is over. The agony of Kosovo must be worked out. Bantu and Afrikaner must live together without preying upon one another. Palestinian and Israeli peoples are every bit as human as one another.
Mm-hmm.
Today we see the violation of the Ukrainian people by the Russians. Must we who are alive pay for the deeds of the dead? Well, we honor treaties, legal contracts, deeds, and entitlements which predecessors have made. Positive historical obligations like these draw us to the dark side of obligations or reparations. So in answer to your question, yes, reparations are appropriate, but they're very complex in light of the fact that the harm done is in the past.
So there we are. So we have some sort of basis in terms of how we should, as people of faith, Christian, this could envelop other categories of faith in terms of dealing with the issue of reparation. That opens us up to delve down a little. We have a call, Reverend Peterson. We want to take the call, and then I want to pull some additional quotes from your article, and think more deeply about reparation, reconciliation, but then more importantly, how do we deal with this issue of apology? Is it a necessary precondition in terms of dealing with a process of reconciliation? We'll go to the caller. Good morning, caller. You're on Boston Praise Radio, Politics and Grits with Kevin Peterson and Aziza Robinson. Good night. Reverend Dr. Peterson is on the call talking about reparations using faith and theology as a particular way of thinking through this issue of reparations in Boston. Good morning. You have a question or a comment?
It's both, really.
Yes.
This is Jamal Crawford. Good morning.
Good morning.
So when we talk about reparations, obviously, there's a governmental impact, which is why, folks are focused on, United States and reparations, or, England or France or Spain or Portugal and reparations, right? Mm-hmm. But then also, too, there's an institutional and, let's say, by industry thing as well. A lot of the schools that were the intellectual basis at the time for slavery and white supremacy and so forth. And it funded a lot of this, research and stuff like that, and eugenics and everything else. And then there's, industries like the trains and so on and so forth. So in that, oftentimes what I find doesn't get examined is, does the church collectively owe reparations? Because as we know, some churches were part of liberation, freedom, and so on and so forth, but some were also the intellectual, moral, and spiritual basis for slave masters as well. And all churches aren't the same, or all denominations of faith aren't the same. So particularly the Catholic Church, as we know throughout the European slave trade, was very sanctioning it, funding it, reaping the benefits of it, the gold, everything else. So in any event, I just want to say, do we think the church as an institution as well, and however that would be set up, because there are those, the Quakers and others who, were part of the liberation, but institutionally there were plenty of churches and those type of organizations that were sanctioning and supporting slavery and reaping the benefits of it?
That's a very good question. I'm gonna just toss it over to Reverend Peterson. Reverend, how culpable, or to what extent is the church culpable of the crimes directed towards black people in this country? Is there an obligation there?
Well, that leads us right to the second question.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, what is owed? Various denominations and churches today are carrying on this discussion. The Episcopal Church in the United States is a paramount example, as also the Presbyterian Church USA. Princeton Theological Seminary just last year decided to donate a large portion of their endowment to deal with issues related to reparation.
Princeton being an institution that had its roots in slavery, correct, in New Jersey?
Well, all denominations, as the caller calls in, have roots in slavery. So that leads us to that second question, not the first. The first is, do we have an obligation? Yes, we do have an obligation. Well, that's part of what's going on right now in society, as we have different institutions analyze their roots.
And then we do sort of historically have the point made by the late activist George Foreman, who in May in 1969 interrupted the services of Riverside Church in New York City to demand of white churches more broadly a response to its complicity in the slave trade and the oppression of black people. And George Foreman, famously covered in the New York Times, interrupted the services of this white church in New York City and demanded reparations and obligation to around the issue of slavery. I want to move very quickly to this issue of obligation as it relates to apology. As Boston sort of moves towards a process of engaging in the issue of research with an eye towards repair and reconciliation, the debate that has been roiling a bit in Boston is apology a precondition towards getting to the more deeper and engaging process of repair and then reparations, and then repair and then reconciliation. How important is apology as a first step in this process, Dr. Peterson?
Apology is important. I don't know that I would call it the first step. The first step is historical realization of what is owed. Then there's the necessity of apology.
Acknowledgement would be the
acknowledgement of what is owed. But as critics of the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, have argued, some people made it through with very little accountability. So the question is, not just is apology needed? Yes, it is. But when does apology, even contrition, seem to allow for impunity? That's where we again come up to restorative justice, which sets out the principles and practices to engage and enable discussion toward what might be reparative acts. Restorative justice can authenticate apology, but it doesn't necessarily do so.
So if there were then a timeline or a process in terms of moving towards what may be the end reconciliation, you would suggest that there first needs to be acknowledgement. This is what I think I'm hearing. That leads to to stating in very concrete terms that yes, there was harm done, and these are the details connected to the harm that's been done, and that's acknowledgement. And then it seems to me that you're saying at that point there is the necessary work of apology after acknowledgement, apology that moves us towards a deeper process of responding to the harm with specific actions and levels of engagement. Do we have that? Do we have that correctly?
With specific principles and practices.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's very easy for contrition to make room for impunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
let me take us a third step.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
If restorative justice principles can enable a discussion of what might constitute reparative acts, certainly this discussion needs to be set in a wider context of obligations and entitlements faced by the living. In other words, we need to deal with the past, but not in isolation from the present. Recently, there's been a strong negative reaction among some people toward reparative acts.
Mm-hmm.
And that's often because their context is not being dealt with. We face the necessity of dealing with current living standards and approaches with people in the context of an inherited past. Both need to be dealt with. The present cannot be held hostage to the past,
mm-hmm.
but it needs to be dealt with nevertheless. And then a fourth question would be, how far back do we reach in seeking to right wrong? Thinking only of the history of the West for the past 2 millennia, does Christian and Jewish treatment of one another count from the 2nd century? What about Constantinopolitan politics in the 5th and 6th centuries respecting populations in the Eastern Mediterranean basin? Christians and Muslims have faced difficulties since the 7th century. How about the English and the Irish since the 12th century?
Mm-hmm.
Do we consider Africans in the 15th century or Mennonites in the 16th century? Then there's the 20th century. Our 4 questions: do I have an obligation? 2, what is the nature of that obligation?
Mm-hmm.
3, how does this obligation fit into a wider context of community? And 4, how far do we need to go to root out the problem? Are issues that take us to the heart of the debate of the legitimacy of restorative justice as opposed to retributive justice. And this is something I'm glad to say many courts and institutions are taking up in our own day.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot proceed as a society with the detrimental situation that the African community has faced, that African Americans have faced in the United States.
We're talking to Reverend Dr. Rodney Peterson. We're having some issues in terms of transmission, but we're having a very engaging conversation about reparations. We're connecting a theological perspective on the issue of reparations. We had a call earlier about how around the question as to whether the church is complicit in terms of responding to this issue of reparations. The answer was affirmative. Institutions across American society, it seems to be the consensus, are indeed responsible. It leads me to a question connected to a piece of text from the essay that I want to read and ask about who should be in this conversation. On I guess the 4th or 5th page of this essay, Dr. Peterson, you said each of us is invited to join the conversation about racism and its relationship to justice and reconciliation differently. racism, discriminatory behavior, or prejudice towards those of another race has been defined in terms of its ideological, structural, and historic significance for the stratification of populations in order to promote or maintain privilege. Race, along with socioeconomic status, ethnicity, gender, religion, and other factors, shapes how a person views the world. While race and culture interrelate, they are not the same. Nevertheless, the extent to which a person's color or ethnic identity becomes an overt or covert source of discrimination affects behaviors that encourage good or poor communication, social cohesion, and division, and affect or impede conflict resolution. Social discrimination, xenophobia, ill treatment of the most vulnerable, violence and rape, and economic consequences that follow are aspects of racism. At the top of that paragraph, you say that each of us are invited. There are obviously white people across this country who again and again say that I am not my father's keeper or my great-great-great-grandfather's keeper. I want to approach this question again around obligation. Whites in this country in 2022 will say, I didn't do the crime, so why should I be involved in the conversation, using your words, to join in the conversation about racism as it relates to reparations? Do you repudiate the assertion of that some whites would make in terms of their insistence that they do not want to or are not obligated to be part of this conversation? How do you feel about that position?
I think every American needs to be a part of this conversation in terms of the future of this country. We can begin with this quotation I read from John Wesley in his book, Thoughts Upon Slavery. And the Lord said, What hast thou done? The vices of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground, taken from Genesis 4. This country has a history of embeddedness in slavery. Not everybody is an individual, but that's where we need to ask, how am I a beneficiary with slavery, and what do I do with it? Now, we honor trusts, we honor obligations like that, inheritances. Well, the obligation to deal with slavery is the dark side of a trust. It's the dark side of the obligation. We need to deal with that, just as we deal with trust.
Rodney Peterson, we're on Politics and Grits with Kevin Peterson, Aziza Robinson. Good night. We have another caller, but I want to ask you about this theme or this concept of forgiveness within this whole narrative or trajectory around reparations as we're discussing. What role does forgiveness play? And when we mention forgiveness, or as I mentioned forgiveness in this context, I'm thinking about forgiveness from those who have been harmed, blacks in particular, more specifically blacks in Boston. Are you thinking about forgiveness in that way, or are you thinking about it in any more expansive way? Forgiveness, what's the role of that?
Well, forgiveness needs to be thought of both conceptually and expansively, as well as individually. Both need to happen. Forgiveness is the doorway to reconciliation. There is no reconciliation apart from forgiveness.
And that forgiveness is being issued by that person or those persons or that people group.
Those persons harmed. And then that needs to be heard. If it's not heard, that doesn't mean my forgiveness didn't mean something.
Okay, so not to be simplistic, where does the issue of forgiveness or the matter of forgiveness occur? If we were thinking about reparations as a process, are African Americans or the descendants of slaves, are they to position themselves as forgivers even before we get into this process of maybe even apology or discussion around reparations? Where does forgiveness happen, as you imagine it?
Apart from living a life of forgiveness,
Mm-hmm.
our personality is warped.
Mm-hmm.
And we look either for vengeance or retribution.
Mm-hmm.
None of that will create a new society. Retribution only creates enemies. It's the big person who forgives. And the African American community has been very big in this regard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And should not step back from that.
Yeah. There are so many historical references to that, but I think more poignantly, a few years ago, as a young deranged gunman went into the Church of God in Charleston and shot 9 people, killed 9 people, including Pastor Pinckney. I recall the immediate response of some of the victims who were in the church that night was one of forgiveness, even before Dylan Roof was indicted or arraigned that very next day. Is that the position of forgiveness that you're talking about? That as soon or as immediately as there is injury done, that there should be a position of forgiveness by everyone, including African Americans. Is that an appropriate metaphor or reference?
I think so, depending on how we might flesh that out.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no doubt about it that forgiveness can seem cheap,
Mm-hmm.
that it can be done with impunity, a lack of depth, a lack of sincerity. This is why forgiveness needs to lead into restorative justice,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because restorative justice discusses the impact to all parties of a crime, the victim, the offender, and the community. There's no way we can say American community is not injured because of race and racism.
We're talking to Dr. Rodney Peterson, visiting scholar and researcher at Duke Divinity School. We are so happy to have him on. We have a caller, and then I have a question that's come in over line or through the internet. The question is, well, let's get to the caller first, and then I want to ask this question. We only have a few more minutes left. This conversation has been rich, but moves forward very, very quickly. Caller, good morning. What's your comment or your question?
Good morning. I have a question. My question is this. Now, how is the United States government, the city of Boston, and the state of Massachusetts is going to add up all the trillions of dollars that's owed to the American descendants of slaves? Because we all know that the workers over time isn't always accurate. So how is the city, the state, and the federal government is going to calculate all those trillions of dollars being owed to American descendants of slaves?
Let me add complexity to your question.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we do so without negatively impacting the current citizens of the city? That is, are we to be held hostage to the past, or can we use the past creatively to benefit everybody in the present? That's going to take a lot of political discussion.
Caller, any response? Is he responding to your question in a way that you feel is appropriate? Caller's gone. So a question that came in through the internet is that the legacy of the slave trade and systemic racism in Boston, I believe they said, persists even to today. How do we calculate into the future responding to the harm in the past, but the harm that continues? I wonder if you could think through that question or respond to that question from the theological lens also. 2028,
These are-
5 year, 20.
these-
I'm sorry, go ahead.
These are political issues in addition to being theological.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was appropriate that Princeton Seminary gave $20,000, gave $20 million in the interest of dealing with reparations that could have been used for scholarship. Well, some money was taken out from that $20 million to use for scholarships of African Americans. I mean, these are political decisions that need to be made. Sometimes they're made with a fiduciary horizon, and other times they're made with a more symbolic horizon.
Mm-hmm.
This is why it's been very important to address the question of the name of Faneuil Hall.
Mm-hmm.
Would it better be called Freedom Hall on the Freedom Trail? I'd say yes, because this is a symbolic gesture which is every bit political and even financial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you raised that issue because we have been talking over the course of these conversations about Faneuil Hall and about whether or not it could be the name change could be construed as a form of reparations, repair. As you know, I've been involved in the Faneuil Hall movement, so to speak, and I've always, along with other activists, have seen Faneuil Hall as a way of beginning to talk about repair and apology and reconciliation. You know that across the South there are cities and municipalities that are bringing down Confederate statues and renaming streets and avenues and schools. Princeton is doing its work. Brown is doing its work. There is great symbolism, as I understand it. Should we continue to insist on addressing these symbols, and to our critics, at what point does it stop? Does it become ineffectual or superfluous?
Well, that's a psychological question, Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
And it relates to how we deal with the issue. I think, as you know, continual pressure done in a loving way can reap great benefits. And the symbolic change of name can be just as important as several $1 million.
Mm-hmm. We have been talking to the Reverend Dr. Rodney Peterson, formerly a mainstay fixture and scholar and religious leader in Boston. He's now down at Duke University. I'm looking forward to heading down to Duke to engage in a reconciliation seminar and workshops earlier this, or I should say, in early summer. Looking forward to being in that area and seeing and participating in the work that Duke is doing in terms of reconciliation. Dr. Peterson, I thank you so much for coming on this morning. I hope that we'll have some other time down the road to re-engage you around thinking about reparations, repair, apology. How do we get to the point where we achieve what Dr. King and John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian have called the beloved community? Slavery, the oppression of indigenous people and black people are the original sins of the republic, about which there needs to be response, not only from our hearts and our souls and through the lens of debt reparation, but also through a spiritual lens. Dr. Peterson, we thank you so much for being on. We're looking forward to having you on again. God bless you, and you take care. This has been another edition of Politics and Grits. Every Thursday morning, 8 a.m. to 9, we're live, drive time. We're going to continue to talk about one of the most important issues in the city of Boston. And that's the issue of race and race resolution and race reparation. No issue is more important We go back to 1638 as some of the earlier African captives were brought to this city. How do we address the issue of reparations? We certainly need to look at Faneuil Hall and name change, but we also need to be very, very serious about this race committee that's been put together. Thank you for listening. We're leaving out. I'm not here next week. You'll hear a repeat, I think, of a sermon, one of my sermons next week that related to Black History Month. We're leaving off with The Blood Still Works, a Pentecostal mainstay, something I like to listen to all the time. It sort of revs me up. Thank you for listening. Politics and Grits, Kevin Peterson, Boston Praise Radio. You have a great day.